The recent campaign by Ron Paul, well, the only campaign by Ron Paul, pretty much, unless you count his 1988 Libertarian Party candidacy for the presidency, has garnered a lot of supporters from various elements of society that I think normally would not support a candidate such as Ron Paul if he wasn't such a strong advocate of pulling the troops out of Iraq and he come out so strongly against the Patriot Act and was going to, and he says he's going to legalize marijuana, and he has a somewhat decent record on certain civil liberties. But I think there are certain undercurrents of the campaign that Ron Paul is running and certain undercurrents of his philosophy that I think need to be exposed at this point, because I think that there's too much focus on what to me amount to be, somewhat peripheral points of his philosophy that lead him to being against the Iraq War and against a violation of civil liberties and stuff. But the main contention that he makes, I think, would ultimately be detrimental to most elements of society. One of the first things I'd like to talk about is that Ron Paul is very much in favor and support of the free market system of economics, American-style libertarianism, as espoused by the Libertarian Party, founded in the 70s here in the States. And while it certainly is a very, very good party as far as most civil liberties are concerned, it's also very, very much a pro-business party that, as a former member in 1999, I can tell you, a member as far as I signed up for their newsletters and things like that. I don't think I gave them any money because I was in college and I was spending that money on like ramen noodles and women and dates, but that's not what we're here for. But anyhow, the Libertarian Party, from my time in it, and I recall, it was very much in favor of all deregulation of business limitations, of inhibiting the rights of capital to flow freely, but it was also very, very much against the rights of workers to do the same thing. Well, Ron Paul comes from that line of thinking, although for a political maverick and someone who gets a lot of press as somebody who's out there, he votes 80% of the time with the Republican Party. It's an ardent supporter and admirer of Ronald Reagan, along with Barack Obama, who I also talk. Nobody can love Ronald Reagan enough for some reason. I guess, the way he took out unions and, poor people was just so exemplary. Everybody's like, now that's it. That's what we're going for. But Ron Paul, like I said, for a maverick, he votes 80% of the time that way. And but his economic policies, let's talk about that for a minute. He supports lax regulation of the stock market, which in my opinion is one of the primary causes of the dot-com bubble, etc. during the Clinton era, was the lax regulation on financial transactions and the use of excuse me, the use of various loopholes and things to and the use of financial institutions to constantly go for speculative purposes instead of solid investment purposes. Well, he's pretty much in support of that, and it kind of led to the corruption and the tendency, for that abusive speculation. So I can't support that, and his policy proposals are very much based on ideas that will enhance and favor the wealthy. For instance, in I believe it was 2006, might have been 2007, he voted against a bill that would have made it easier for unions to organize in the workplace, and the reason he did so was because of his ardent support of property rights. He thinks the government has no right to enforce or enact legislation that encroaches upon the rights of property, which incidentally is the rights of capital, the rights of business owners, the rights of corporations. Although he does speak a lot about the ills of corporations and does want to repeal NAFTA and CAFTA and that's definitely not a bad thing. I can't disagree with him about that. That's been terrible for the American worker. There's no getting around that. But he also supports the dismantling of OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Hazards Administration, which admittedly is very underfunded and as he says, can be worked around by very, very rich folks, and business owners. But which is why he's against the Endangered Species Act, incidentally. I'll get to that in a second, but I don't think that dismantling it is going to be the answer. Also, he's against the minimum wage. He's very much, like I said, he's very much against union support. Essentially, he's very much for the dismantling of all the workers' rights programs, Social Security, etc., that were gained by the bloodshed of the labor movement of the late 1800s and early 1900s. And people died for these things. It's very important to note that people, and Ron Paul wants to get rid of it all. There's no getting around that. And for someone who comes out so ardently in support of civil liberties, and someone who speaks very frankly about how the government should have very little right to regulate civil liberties, he's an ardent denial of women's right to choose in regards to their own reproductive rights. In fact, he's voted. He wants to make it a states' rights issue, which, if you'll recall, was the hallmark issue of the desegregation movement of the 50s and 60s. People were like, it should be a states' rights thing. The federal government shouldn't do it. Historically, it's what, and that's also what people who supported slavery said. It should be a states' rights thing. Historically, it's used for racism. So I think that's a very ominous term to utilize in regards to human liberties and the rights of women, if you ask me. And he's also supported various federal legislation to inhibit judges to be able to interpret and rule on Roe versus Wade. He wants to do that. There's, as far as the accusations that Ron Paul is a bigot, there's probably a modicum of truth, at least a modicum of truth to it. He certainly has gotten endorsements from very questionable elements of society, such as Stormfront.org, a notorious neo-Nazi website. They put a link up, gave him $500. David Duke supports Ron Paul's presidency. That doesn't necessarily de facto make Ron Paul a racist, but I haven't heard any loud, outward denials of the of the support or anything. That doesn't mean they're not there. It means I haven't heard them. His name was on these newsletters in the early 90s, and he claims he didn't write these newsletters, but if he didn't write them and these racist things got in there and now he's trying to disassociate himself with these things, well, then he's probably not capable of running the presidency if he can't keep hateful, racist thoughts in a newsletter that has his name on it. And he's like, I don't know who wrote them. They're just there. Well, if he can't be responsible for the newsletter, Ron Paul Political Action Report, I don't recall if that's the exact name, but it's something thereof, then how could he possibly run the country, right? In my opinion, I think these are bad things. In addition, he said some very questionable things about the Civil War. He doesn't think it should have been fought. He says that it didn't have to be fought. 600,000 Americans died needlessly. And he says that they should have bought the slaves and then freed them. Well, that's all well and good up to an extent, and certainly he is correct in regards to the fact that that is what the British Empire did. That is the way various other empires got rid of slavery. But with his ardent support of property rights and his ardent supports of the right of the capital owner, well, what if they don't want to sell? What do you do then? Because in all honesty, since he also supports the free market, slavery's great for the free market. It works great. That so what would he have done in that case? I don't know, and that's certainly tied up with the welfare of millions and millions of African Americans at that time. It doesn't necessarily mean that he's a bigot, but it does mean that he said some things that you kind of have to turn your head about. I mean, he also voted to ban gay couples from being able to adopt in Washington D.C. He says that the notion, this is a direct quote, right here, the notion of a rigid separation between church and state has no basis in either the text of the Constitution or the writings of our founding fathers.